First up is Venom: The Last Dance. This is the third of these Tom Hardy-led Venom movies, which are technically adjacent to the Spider-Man movies and maybe vaguely acknowledge the MCU. It's all very complicated due to IP negotiations, but my sincerest hope is that this is a true title in that this is the last dance for these characters. And I say this as someone who is a fan of Tom Hardy and his acting. I totally acknowledge, not really a Venom person. I know there's a large fan base of the character of Venom. I don't dislike it, but I just, it's not my top superhero / symbiote of choice. Nothing wrong with it, but I just don't think these films have necessarily resonated with me. And again, I say it as someone who likes Tom Hardy. I know for a fact I have seen all three of these films, and yet they just slip out of my brain almost immediately after seeing them. The first one was set in San Francisco, and I'm from the Bay, so I was like, yay. Okay. And then all I could do during the movie is think about how the geography of it made absolutely no sense. And also I could not tell the difference between, the Venom symbiote fighting with a different symbiote. And I was like, why would you choose this? Anyway, this is a tangent. So Venom: The Last Dance picks up after the events of the last Venom film, Let There Be Carnage. And, I don't remember what happened in that one. I don't know if I need to remember because this one opens with absolute gobbledygook that we have not been introduced to before about the lore of the symbiotes and their origins and their nemesis, etc., and it just felt like dropped out of a video game. And I don't say that with shade to video games. I've actually seen most video games have better production quality at this point than what I saw in the first few minutes of this setup. So if you haven't seen the other ones, one, I don't know why you'd be dropping into this one, but, if you haven't seen the other ones, you're a little bit rusty. This kind of is just all you need to know is that Venom and Eddie are together and they are on the run from the police. That's where we're at. But then we go on this zany semi-road trip adventure. Y'all, it was rough. It felt long, and yet it was not that long. I don't understand how the time dilation of my existence as an audience member worked. In terms of returning characters, we just have Tom Hardy and Peggy Lou as Mrs. Chen. Highlight of the film for me. I do love Mrs. Chen, And again, I do like the relationship between Eddie Brock and the character of Venom, and then a Mrs. Chen character, who's one of the few characters that Venom reveals himself to and doesn't eat. We've also got Juno Temple as a scientist in actual Area 51, I guess. I don't even have to hide it. You've got Chiwetel Ejiofor. You've got Rhys Ifans. You've got Alana Ubach. You've got Stephen Graham is back. You've got Cristo Fernandez. And clearly somebody in the casting department was a fan of Ted Lasso, which I respect and support. But honestly, Juno Temple and Cristo Fernandez deserve better. Everyone deserved better. It didn't make sense. It wasn't that funny. The action was whatever. The stakes did not feel like they were there. They're fighting aliens that just you haven't seen before. And yes, I know Venom is an alien. I hope this is not a huge spoiler, but you do get to see other symbiotes take form, and that should be exciting. And yet it just feels like a merchandising play. You don't know anything about them. And they just look distinct. And also I have such beef with the way the female ones present. I'm we don't have to, it just who is this for? Who is this for is my other question. One of my friends was sitting next to me. He's a huge Venom fan, clearly. He was that can't be this character, and there's no way that this is this because of their powers and blah, 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 blah. I was okay, so it's not for the hardcore Venom fans. I do think because it sits outside of some of the drama that's happening in the MCU, because again, Venom technically part of that, but also not part of it. So they can acknowledge it, but they also can't. I know, complicated. Honestly, that storyline, aka the IP agreements, more interesting than the actual Venom: The Last Dance. There are some really weird, absurd moments in this. I feel like part of it was just how do we show off different animals as symbiotes? This is now the movie premise. That does not a movie make. That does not a movie make. Again, Tom Hardy is a good actor, but it's time to hang up the symbiote cloak. Also, very funny to me that I know it's hard at this point to avoid somebody who's been in a different franchise. Tom Hardy has been in Batman. Chiwetel Ejiofor is in Doctor Strange. Rhys Ifans is in the other Spider-Man, So it's just wow, we are really just, there's only X number of actors in Hollywood that they're willing to cast, apparently. This was stupid. It was stupid. Characters make terrible decisions. I hope this is not a major spoiler, but there's one point where I was these are the most, just negligent parent characters I think I've ever seen on film, maybe short of the parents who leave Kevin behind for Home Alone, but actually no, because they are not putting their children in willing danger. They're just forgetful. No. If you're a huge Venom fan, no. If you are looking to escape this weekend, I don't even think in good conscience I can recommend that. Maybe if you want to turn on the background when it goes out on video, fine. I guess I technically liked it more than Joker Folie à Deux because it was shorter, but that's about all I got for it. I really hope that we have, hung up our hats on this. We can let Venom go. I don't think I'm going to get my wish here, but, I can at least warn you, I am only going to give this a 2 out of 5, and I think I'm actually probably being generous. The next film I have is called Anora, and this is from director Sean Baker, who I am a big fan of his work. It is about a sex worker played by Mikey Madison who ends up in the life of this young Russian billionaire, and they enter into a relationship which his parents are hardcore set against. So it's about trying to navigate the familial politics of this situation. My challenge with this film is I think it got aggressively overhyped for me. So I do want to reset your expectations. I do think it's a good film. I, was along for the ride. I was emotionally invested in it. I know some of it is a little sensationalized because, she's a sex worker. And yes, there's a fair amount of sex and stripping and all that stuff. Sex workers and strippers, not the same thing, but just throwing it out there. There's the sexy, sensational side of that, but it's also about the sort of drama of the relationship and these two young people who are not necessarily responsible enough to be making the decisions they're making, and yet aggressively committed to it. So it is a stressful film in many senses, which I actually thought felt realistic in many ways. I didn't love something like Uncut Gems because it was a bit too extreme in terms of stress. This has peaks and valleys for it, which I really appreciated. I think Mikey Madison, who plays Anora, is a superb actress. She plays the role that she has been given very, very well. My challenge was, one, I think it's about 20 minutes too long. It's 2 hours and 20 minutes. 2, there are some things in it that really kind of rub me the wrong way. And I think that they are defensible in terms of, and I'll say what they are. There's a lot of homophobic slurs and calling people, misogynistic things as an insult. And I'm like, yes, this feels true to what Russian, effectively, mobsters would be calling each other as an insult. But because this film takes place in modern times, etc., I'm like, could we not have found a substitute for this? It made it feel dated in a way that rubbed me the wrong way. I don't think other people are necessarily going to pick up on it in the same way, but there are just moments like that I'm like, ooh, if we had just done one more pass on this would have maybe been, a top 10 film for me. But because there are just little things here and there, and maybe I will totally check my biases, maybe it is just a hardcore liberal nature of me that I'm like, it's just jarring for me to hear these things, and he's trying to be realistic too, but I truly do think that there's a world in which Sean Baker could have just done one more pass on this and achieved the same goal of insulting people, I guess, without putting women and gay people down, And again, it's through the lens of the characters. I don't think Sean Baker's a homophobe, but I'm just like, oh, I wish. Again, it's long. I think that is my other big thing about it, and I think it can get a little repetitive. We get it. They're sexy. They're having a relationship. It's a sexy relationship. Cool. All right. I think he actually does such a good job of establishing the relationship between Anora and her beau that, he spends too much time doing it, and he's already achieved his goal. And then, the chasing around of young, dumb people by more responsible people at the beck and call of parents and the power dynamics and the socioeconomic part of it, that was really interesting to me. I think he just got a little caught up in some of the glitz and glam, and then the glitz and glam on two different levels, right? There's the really rich glitz and glam, and then there's the glitz and glam and showiness of the strippers, and then also the sex workers. Not the same thing, but sometimes there's crossover. So again, I enjoyed the film. I thought it was well done. I just wish my expectations had been tempered. I think it's a very good film. I think it's really strong performances. There's also one character in it who I was just totally rooting for. I was like, I have no idea who you are, but I think you're wonderful. And the fact that, Sean Baker has made me root for this character is just so outside the scope of my norm. But I think it is worth seeing. But I would just temper your expectations for it. If you're a fan of Sean Baker's work, I think you'll see thematically where he is going from Red Rocket or the Florida Project, continuing to explore maybe some of the overlooked members of society. I think one of the challenges with that is when you bring in hyper rich characters, it does skew that commentary in a way. But if you are on the fence about it and you think there are things about it that are a little too sensational, this is what I'm gonna have to say. I think it gets a bit overindulgent in those moments at points. And I'm not saying I'm prudish or anything like that. I'm like, oh man, it's much in a way that I don't know if it advances the story at that point. So if you're really averse to that, this might not be for you. But overall, I think it's a solid film. I think it's worth seeing. Just again, temper thy expectations. I'm going to give it a 3.9 out of 5. The last film I have this week is called Conclave, and on paper, I would have guessed I would have probably bristled against this film a little bit just because, one, part of it's the time of year it's coming out. It feels like a gimme an Oscar film, and sometimes I'm like, ugh. Can we not just make stories like this for the sake of telling stories to try and get an award? And I'm not saying that's what this is. In fact, I feel like this is maybe the opposite in some senses. It is from Edward Berger. He directed the 2022 All Quiet on the Western Front, and it has Ralph Fiennes, Stanley Tucci, John Lithgow, Lucienne Mismati, Isabella Rossellini, and a ton of other super talented actors. And it takes place during a papal election. And again, as someone I'm not familiar with, I generally know the jokes about the smoke color and all that stuff, but I have no affiliation with the Catholic Church. So it's very much a spectator sport for me. The idea is that these are characters that are voting on a conclave of cardinals or bishops or whatever it is are voting on having to replace the pope and elect the next pope. And so it's about the politicking between them and like what they stand for. And of course, it very much maps to elections. And I would say in particular, it feels very timely for the US election. And so that made it very hard to watch in many, many senses, because you're like, oh, these are in theory supposed to be all upstanding characters, which is not applicable necessarily to politics. But, the idea that the church represents, people who are supposed to be our spiritual leaders or some people's spiritual leaders. And yet there's a bunch of dirt happening and maybe, some questionable campaigning, all that stuff. I was like, oh, too close to home, but this is also being told really well. So it's about that process. And, they have to sequester themselves and there are all these rules and just the popular vote and like what values they all are standing for. And then it kind of like unravels in a mystery way. And I was just enraptured by it. I didn't think I would be. I think, again, some of it is maybe a morbid curiosity. Some of it is they are able to map the larger themes to not just religious themes. And, these are wider political themes. But man, I was in on this one. I saw this at TIFF, so I have to acknowledge, like, there's a little bit of the I've seen too many movies in a day mania that happened. But this one really stood out to me as one that I was like, oh, this is so strong and so solid, and I feel good about recommending it to pretty much everyone. Like, I don't see a reason for anybody not to see it. I immediately was like, my parents will like this. And not my parents are not religious, but they will just like the, politicized nature of the characters and the circumstances and pomp and pageantry to all of it, because the Catholic Church, that as far as I could tell, is like the dichotomy of, we're supposed to be good leaders and like we're not here to advance ourselves. And yet there's so much like visual pageantry to it. So I thoroughly enamored of this film. I thought Ralph Fiennes was wonderful in it. All the cast is great. I have to give a shout out to Carlos Dietz, who was in it. I wasn't familiar with his work before, but he is so good in it. So yeah, Conclave, an unexpected one for me that I just really, really appreciated. It's tight. It tells the story it wants to tell. It's engaging the entire way through. There are like twists and turns and all that stuff. So yeah, Conclave is a 4.5 out of 5 from me.